NSFW. People who have found a dead body. What's the story? I was 21. I woke up around 9:30 or 10. I peeked in my mom's room to say good morning. Her TV was on but she wasn't there. She liked to use the bathroom in the master bedroom if it was available. More privacy, I guess. And the door to the master was cracked, so I figured, oh, she's in the bathroom. Let me take the dogs outside to do their thing. Well, about 10 minutes later I come back inside and she's still not in her room, so I go peek inside the master to see if she's feeling okay. It's dark and I see her asleep on a recliner. So I call out mom a few times quietly and then go to nudge her knee and she is ice. Ucking. Cold. I finally look up at her face and realize she's dead and has been for a while, maybe a few hours. Mouth hanging open, staring into the nothing, she's completely pale and her lips were blue. It was the most traumatic thing I have ever experienced and it has really ucked me up. That woman was my absolute best friend in the entire world. They said she had a heart attack. It will be 7 years this July and the thought of seeing her like that still makes my anxiety skyrocket. If you read this far, thanks. Rip Mama. My freshman year of college, right during winter finals, my closest college friend who liked top-ranked me was in his bed, ignoring his alarm. His roommate came to get me to wake him up. It was a lofted bed. I figured it was a setup. I climbed up there and immediately knew something was horribly wrong and yelled for someone to call for help. His face is still burned into my mind, over 20 years later. I would describe it as scared, with his eyes wide open and his mouth agape as if he were gasping or trying to scream. His hands gripped his sheets tightly. An hour plus of attempts to revive him in the dorm hallway failed. We found out later that he grew up with heart-related issues and his aorta tore in his sleep before his 19th birthday. Before we leaned the cuz I barely slept 4 weeks. I was terrified whatever got him was getting me next because we spent so much time together. All these years later, and I'm still in loose contact with his family. My wife died suddenly in the shower 3 years ago. No scream, just collapsed. I thought she had dropped a bottle of shampoo, but when I went to check on her, dead. Tried doing chest compressions with EMS on the phone, didn't work. I was beside myself with grief and guilt for 3 days, until the autopsy revealed a tear in her aorta. There was nothing I could have done to save her. I am still traumatized by the suddenness, the unfairness of it all. The fact we didn't even get a minute to say goodbye, and she's just gone. I want to thank the community at Our Widowers which supplied me, and many others in the same situation, with grief counseling. Edit. Wow. I want to thank everyone for their kind words of sympathy. My wife was 53 at the time, 1 week before her 54th birthday. I had already bought her a bottle of fancy sake to share on her birthday, but I had to raise a glass by myself, tow her ashes. The autopsy stated the actual cause of death was hemopericardium brought on by an aortic dissection. She had been complaining of lower back pain for 2 weeks before she died, because blood was leaking out and pooling in her lower back. We had assumed she might have a kidney stone that was causing the pain. There was nothing that could have been done for her aside from open heart surgery. Like a lot of you who are commenting, I had no idea people could die so quickly from this. I assumed we die from a long illness, or maybe something quicker, like a car accident. But there would still be time to turn to each other and hold hands, and say our I love you, instead of dying alone in a tub. A still ugly cry about it once in a while. Our cats need me, so I power through the despair. Be kind to one another. On my way to work at 3:30 in the morning. I was carpooling with 2 other guys. We were going through Walcott Court. Anyone that knows that area knows there's a lot of woods. Anyway, I noticed brake lights that were illuminated behind some trees, so I pulled over to check it out. It was this red SUV blasting reggaeton. The driver had his head slumped down like he was sleeping. I noticed about 20 open beers in the back seat, so we thought he was just drunk. We started to knock on the door to wake him up while we waited for the cops to show up. About 5 minutes later, a cop car pulls up. Officer goes to the driver's side and turns on his flashlight. The second it turned on, we immediately saw the bullet holes on the side of the driver's side door. In like less than a minute, there was at least 10 cop cars shutting everything down. My uncle was supposed to take my dad to a doctor's appointment and never turned up. I went to check in, found him dead on his living room floor. Do not recommend. I was 8 years old. Came home from school to find my dad had come home early from work. Went into house, saw wallet and wedding ring on kitchen table and found him dead in my bed clutching my teddy bear. That was a lot of years ago, but forever crystal clear. Edit. Thanks for all the messages. I am traveling abroad, so not able to answer everyone, but realize I left this a bit brief. My dad was an early patient for quadruple bypass heart surgery. At that time, the 5-year mortality rate was not good. He told a coworker, best friend, he wasn't feeling well and left work early. We have always assumed he knew what was happening and got home, removed jewelry and wallet and passed away. I do have quite a few memories and lots of people have told me how proud he was of me. I think he went to be close to me and didn't expect me to find him. There is a long, insignificant story behind how I ended up being the one and not my mom. It definitely sucked for quite a while, but moving and kind of starting over helped. I have great friends and a great family with 3 boys of my own. Was out driving one night in college with my ex. Woos to just go on long drives together to talk about stuff and get away from the university. We were maybe 45 minutes into the country under a pitch black sky filled with stars and came over a hill to see 2 red tail lights off in a field. It was so dark that was all we could see until we got closer and saw it was a car crashed directly into a willow tree and the driver was all mangled and dead in the driver's seat, partially out the windshield. We called the cops, but since it was in the middle of nowhere, it took a bit to get service and then a bit longer for them to get out to us. Saddest thing about it was that the driver was a teenager. I came home to find my roommate dead in the bathtub after she intentionally took a lot of epilepsy pills and likely seized in the tub and drowned. That hurt a lot. Edit. This gained a lot more traction than anticipated. Not sure which medication she was on, but we found pages she had printed off with warnings and potential side effects of misuse. She either just fell asleep or seized. Both were listed as side effects of overdosing. My best friend hung himself from the monkey bars in his backyard with a dog leash. I found him hanging there and tried to save him by holding his legs and lifting him up. Vomit all over me, and fat smell. UCK. I moved to a different state years later, and in high school I had a teacher who was talking about how one of his students in state I came from died via dog leash hanging. Turned out to be the same kid. My then teacher was the principal of the school my friend attended, and my friend was always in trouble in the principal's office, so they knew each other well. A few years after I graduated, the teacher was arrested for charges of statutory ex-offense and taking indecent liberties with a child. A 3-year-old. I still think he had something to do with my friend's suicide. Edit. He was 10, I was 8. Greater than dude had just freshly died in a car wreck, was driving at 11 p.m. to a Waffle House for some AMN fine chicken and waffles. I am about 900 feet driving 80 to the exit off-ramp when a car flies by me doing what seemed like at least 100 miles per hour plus. I watched him not slow down enough for the turn, then he started going off the road to the left, overcorrect, then lose control of his car, and drive into a guardrail full speed. I am obviously first one to the crash. Dust still hadn't settled from the impact. The car was low enough that the front hood had gone under the rail and was wedged in between it and the road. As the driver wasn't wearing his seatbelt, groan, his lifeless body was smashed between the steering wheel, dashboard, and the roof of his car. Dude was mushed like a grape. I used my car to block the scene so first responders could arrive. There was nothing to do except unwedge his car and collect him. He was pronounced dead on the scene. I watched the news the next night make a small mention of his deathbed. That was it. Never got his name. The chicken and waffles had no flavor and I didn't sleep that night at all. Wear your seatbelt and slow the UCK down. This is the classic domestic violence story of man kills woman because if I can't have her nobody else will story. At 14 I woke to find my mother with a shotgun hole in her chest under the kitchen table and her murderer outside under the clothesline with his brains blown out. The only difference between this and other stories like this is I am the kid who wasn't murdered with her mother. Edit. Some people asked how was it possible to sleep through a shotgun blast, and well, let's ride this horse a little longer and I will open up more about this and my recollections. I am old. This happened in the 80s. So story continued. I don't fucking know. I honestly don't. I think my brain protected me. It kept me asleep. But let me tell you what it was like to wake up to that. I woke up at 9 a.m. I know it was 9 a.m. because I looked at the clock and wondered what the UCK was going on. You see, she was leaving him that morning with me. We were meant to have left at 4 a.m. and I could not understand why I was still there. Where was everybody, including 3 inside dogs? So 2 things, it was 9 a.m. and the house was dead silent, just like the movies, not one ucking sound, no birds, no sound of life except me wandering around the house with increasing frequency looking for my mother and John, that was his name. I walked past both of them multiple times. I did not see them. At some point I must have started to panic because when I noticed the dogs locked up in a downstairs room I knew something was wrong, very wrong. It was after that I am standing in the kitchen and see a foot with my mother's furry slipper on it underneath the kitchen table. I move the table and I am sorry to say this, but even after 35 years this is the first thing I see when I think of my mother. a gaping hole in her chest and blood coagulated on her glasses. I don't know how long Shay was laying there. At the same time, I wanted Toto something. I knew there was nothing to be done. Then I started looking for John, and that is when I saw him under the clothesline. I went closer to him too, and I remember a hole in his head but not much more. That was when I called asked 911. Ran out of the house and started screaming for my auntie. Well, lived in a farm and she lived on a house not far from us. Then everything sort of gets blank till the ambulance got there. I went to bring in the mail after a 2-week vacation and noticed my neighbor's box was just as full as mine. Bobby was an older man, drunk, fat, poor and borderline disabled, and most days I bring Ismail in for him so he didn't have to get in his cardo drive to the box. I grabbed his mail and brought it in his house. Noticed immediately it was just as cold inside as outside, mid-January. I opened the basement door and heard the TV and went to his man cave. His couch faced the TV and the back of the couch faced the stairs, so I couldn't see his face right away. I called for him and then made the mistake of putting my hand on his shoulder to get his attention. Bob was very, very dead. So dead he didn't seem to have eyes anymore. My hand kinda mushed down on his shoulder too. Immediately evacuated and called the police. Turns out he had been dead 3-ish weeks, and if I had checked on him before I left the morning of my vacation, he might not have died. Awful. I had COVID the months to this previously and never got my sense of smell back. Even today I still can't smell, so I didn't smell him. The cold temps kept bugs from populating on him too, so I didn't get any warning of it. I was so shook up over it I didn't do much more than eat, sleep and work for a couple weeks. I was 3 or 4 and didn't really understand what was going on. The long end short is that someone got shot in a drive-by, took off running, and collapsed under my bedroom window. I found him in the morning and told my mom. She went out to look, and then I remember being swept up and taken into the other room. A bunch of cops came, but that's about all I really remember. My boyfriend was a Marine veteran who served in Afghanistan. I went to go pick up lunch because he hadn't eaten all day and just said goodbye to his nana who was on life support in the hospital. I asked him to come with me. He said he'd rather be one. I figured he didn't want me to see him grieving, but that he'd put coffee on for us. I got back to his house, smelled the coffee, called his name, then saw that the dog was sitting in the hallway, ears pinned back, and wouldn't move. I looked in the living room and found him on the floor. I thought he was napping. The brain is a hell of a thing. He sometimes slept on the floor, so instead of noticing the gore, my brain told me he was napping. I told him to get up, lunch was here. He didn't move or respond. I went closer and noticed his body was in a weird position to be comfortable for sleeping. I ran over, saw blood coming from his nose, his eyes wide open and stained yellow. Then I realized I was inches from kneeling in his brain matter and shattered skull. He told me his gun was locked up, told his dad he didn't even have his gun at the house. Ucked me up forever, and I'll never stop regretting leaving him alone. End veteran suicide. Rest in sweetest peace. My Joe was laying in bed watching TV with my GF at the time, and her dad had moved in with us recently. Heard the loudest snoring ever coming out of his room real early, and we almost went to check on him but figured he just had a long night and was exhausted. Got up, went throughout the day, breakfast, chores, all the Saturday morning stuff we do. 2 p.m. rolls around and he still hasn't come out of his room. Had a bad feeling, so I kicked the door in and found him sitting there in his underwear, pale bluish-white eyes and mouth open. Apparently he'd gone out with some friends, and they gave him some dope, which turned out to be mostly fentanyl. The snoring we heard was a death rattle, and he was already dead before we even went to sleep. I was an apartment manager at a complex that were technically condos, but the guy that developed them had owned a majority for like 20 years. There was this older lady that owned her own unit, and we all knew she was a little off and kept to herself, but we all went out of our way to check on her and see if she needed anything. It was wintertime, so the hallways were much cooler than normal. We hadn't seen her for several days, and there was a slight smell starting in the hallway. I knew what it was, so I called the police and they came out with the fire department. No one would go in, so it was up to me and my boss to open the window and go in. No one knew of any relatives or anything, so I dug through some of her belongings after they took her out, and after a couple days found an old photo with a couple names on it. I was the one that tracked her daughter down and broke the news to her. She hadn't seen her mom for over 20 years, and the mom she knew was seriously mentally ill. I was able to share what I knew about her, how she seemed happy, would let people help her some, and everyone kind of looked out for her. Her daughter said that she remembered her mom keeping all the appliances unplugged because they would talk to her otherwise. All the appliances were unplugged. So despite the poor old lady having some mental issues, she ended up finding some peace in the world living in that unit. It really brought her family a sense of peace also. Was 20 when I found my best friend hanging from a pipe. When we got him out of there, we found several 30 packs of beer in his closet. He wanted us to have a party as we sent him off. A few years ago I saw a body lying face down in the River Clyde. It was early morning as I was on my way to work and they had got tangled up in some rocks. Some other people walking along the same path also saw them and I had to stop them from trying to get down to the body. You could tell from the way the body was bloated that they couldn't be saved, and I phoned the police to come. Was a weird day in work after that.